Hi, I'm the wrong hero. And you are tuned to our lengthy political anthology broadcast project, call it what you will, part 18 of a 24-part series called PAP. And yes, as I mentioned before, and as I don't want to have to keep repeating myself, I'll mention it one more time, and that's it. I am the wrong hero. And I thought a good way to begin this presentation would be to read something said by Matthew Rothschild in the Progressive of June 1997. Rehnquist and 5 of his colleagues said that the stability of the two-party system was more important than the First Amendment free association rights that the new party said were at stake. In re the Fusion Party ruling. The court must be living in another world. Day by day, case by case, it is busy designing a constitution for a country I do not recognize, says Antonin Scalia in the Supreme Court Reporter. As for what Bob Dole had to say about that $300,000 loan, the hell is that? That's not a loan, it's a lottery win. It's like a forger posting bail with a third-party out-of-state check. Oh, whoa! Wait a minute. I'm the one that made that loan. Well, it was a fine thing to do for Newt Gingrich and the Republican Party, and it was a loan. Yeah, it was a loan. Of course, it was a loan. What do you think? I'd just give away $300,000, a cold 300 grand, not on your bottom dollar. The image of the lounging sultans of academe is a highly effective weapon in a class and race-based war over who will and who will not have access to a bachelor's degree. Legislatures looking for budget cuts could have targeted higher education, says Susan Douglas. Once again, the future of Western civilization was freighted onto the shoulders of the latest guy who can throw, hit, kick a ball. In the April GQ, Tiger Woods speculated that good-looking women hang around baseball and basketball because black guys have big dicks. Now, I didn't say it. Tiger Woods said it. The beginners have always been again everything. If he says yes, I say no, says Molly Ivins. In re, Bill Clinton being in favor of volunteerism, and so, of course, everybody else being not in favor of it. Well, recently, that is, as of early August. I know you're seeing this in late September, but hey, that's not too bad, right? I'm only 6 months behind the time. Won't be long before I've actually completely caught up. Although, it's difficult to make these calculations. But I suppose sometime in early December or late November, I will actually be talking about things that happened 1 week ago instead of 3 months ago. Anyhow, Bill Clinton has, with the aid of the Republican Party, passed a tax break which makes 2 years at a community college virtually free for everybody. Then again, 2 years at a community college is, in fact, worth about the cost that one would pay under the new tax break. What I want to know is, what's in it for me? I ain't got no kids. Why should my taxes go to support a bunch of loafers who have spawn? Oh, I know. If we don't have children, then immigrants will take over. I mean, that's that old argument that went out with the days of the dinosaurs. No, that doesn't hold water as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'm calling this presentation PAP, not in honor of Huckleberry Finn's alcoholic father who wore crosses at the bottom of his hobnailed boots, not in honor of my grandfather, God bless his soul, who's 96 years young, and other nauseating encomiums to my blood relative. No, because, well, let's do the most hackneyed thing imaginable. What is that, you suppose? Well, let's do something which in fact itself constitutes the very type of PAP which I'm talking about. Let's go to the dictionary. Now, most people who want to play this game go to the Oxford English Dictionary, but I don't have the unabridged Oxford English Dictionary, so the third edition of the American Heritage Dictionary will have to do. See, when I call this presentation PAP, I am attempting to imply several things, one of which, perhaps the most profound of which, is that we are all being fed baby food. What is a PAP? According to the Midwestern U.S. slang, it is a tit or nipple, or something resembling a nipple. Say a sugar tit. See papilla. Of course, papilla, when we go to that, means a small nipple-like projection, such as a protuberance on the skin, at the root of a hair or feather, or at the base of a developing tooth. One of the small, round, or cone-shaped protuberances on the top of the tongue that contain taste buds. A pimple or pustule. Well, anyway, getting back to PAP. Gotta get back to PAP. Soft or semi-liquid food as for infants. Material lacking real value or substance. Money and favors obtained as political patronage. Self-seeking politicians primarily interested in patronage, privilege, and pap. Middle English from Old French papa, from Latin, children's word for food. Yes, but where does it come from in the Indo-European roots? Let's see if we can find it, or something like it. Papa, important derivatives are papa and pope. Papa, a children's word for father, a linguistic near universal found in many languages. Papas, pope, from Greek, papas, father, and papos, grandfather. Well, that's too bad. Doesn't give us much information about the Indo-European roots, but I suppose pap is one of those words that just keeps going and going and going. And so, seeing as how it is a near universal concept, I thought it would be nice for a change, rather than attempt to recreate the kind of drivel which one so often sees on other less well-informed programs than this, that I would deliberately call this PAP because it is the very opposite of what I intend to offer. So, anyway, they say that conservatives are losing faith in Trent Lott. Well, geez, Crimea River. This is according to the American Spectator of June 1997. Roger Williams, an important figure in Rhode Island. He was the first person in modern Christianity to assert, in its plenitude, the doctrine of the liberty of conscience, the equality of opinions before the law, and in its defense he was the harbinger of Milton, the precursor and superior of Jeremy Taylor. Ellen DeGeneres and Anne Heche were received by Bill Clinton in the second photo. He's grinning like a traveling man who's decided to blow the last night of the convention on the two-girl double-action special, says the ever-waspish Mark Stein. Mark Stein only ever seems to have a kind word for people about whom it would be injudicious not to have a kind word about. Like, for example, Jimmy Stewart. Well, according to Harriet Vane in the Weekly Standard of May 26, 1997, what can possibly be wrong with the mental processes of our country's leaders? Can they delude themselves into thinking that lofty postures and cliches during earnest meetings are apt to achieve anything at all? I guess if they allow themselves to recognize their own vacuousness, they might not feel good about themselves. Well, I'm not feeling so good about myself because I'm actually running out of time. Isn't that odd? And we're only 5 minutes into this. Well, 10 minutes. Still, I guess I may be able to continue this at another time. I certainly hope that is the case. So what I'll do is I'll set the display on to the counter and I will resume. Well, I'm back, and in the words of David Mamet, I'm more at peace with myself than ever before. Hi, I'm the wrong hero, and this is pap. Pure, unadulterated pap, as opposed, of course, to the impure, adulterated kind, which is so popular with other entertainers, who I don't care to name at this time. Well, tactics, according to Saviili Tartakower, tactics is what you do when there is something to do. Strategy is what you do when there is nothing to do. And so, thought you'd just like to know that because it is a very handy thing to keep in mind. Well, Noemi Emery refers to LBJ as secretive and grandiose. This in the Weekly Standard of May 26th. Robert F. Kennedy saw LBJ much as Hamlet saw Claudius, a blousy satyr on a martyr's throne. Eugene McCarthy, a fey and chilly poet-priest, the temperamental opposite of both Johnson and the brothers Kennedy. McCarthy disdained both ambition and power, and was so far above pandering he could barely ask people for votes. As a cultural stance, this had its attractions, as when it helped make a cult hero of the late Adlai Stevenson, but it could prove a drawback in national politics. Of course, the obvious example in modern times is Ralph Nader. McCarthy didn't throw cold water on the New York primaries. He pissed on it, says Harold Ickes, cited by the ubiquitous Naomi Emery. In 1948, Humphrey had been a brave figure, battling for civil rights before it seemed prudent or popular. By 1968, he was a broken one. His public antennae decayed. Now there's another good title for a presentation to come. Public antennae. And indeed, I have too many titles. I do not have the problem which Christopher Buckley in Rye Martinis professedly had in coming up with titles. I have too many titles and not enough things to attach them to. That's my compelling problem. So, you want to hear about 1968? Well, 1968 was the year the Democrats destroyed themselves. In 1968, the Democratic Party underwent a kind of cultural brain transplant, according to William Bennett. The word traditional became synonymous with wrong. Traditional was not wrong to FDR, to Harry S. Truman. One forgets how corny these people had been in their instincts, how devout in reflexive American patriotism, how middle class in their cultural tastes and fancies, how fond of the ethic of duty and effort, how sure that they knew right and wrong. It was these things that the left began to demolish, fueled by their rage at the year and their leaders. If the right, misled by George Wallace, veered off into repression and mindless jingoism, the left veered off into mindless nihilism and violence, confusing one war with all wars, bad rules with all rules, and one administration they disliked and distrusted with all of American history. Cops used to vote Democratic, and then they heard the kids saying, "You're the MF and your wife's a whore," according to Barney Frank. This drove the stake through the heart of the FDR party. It has not been remade to this day. The real mark of 1968 was the start of the rise of the right. Nixon and Wallace got 56.7% of the vote, as opposed to LBJ's 61.1% of the vote only 4 years earlier in 1964. And Hubert Humphrey only got 42.7% of the vote in 1968. The year of derision, I guess we could call it. course, I was too young to really pay attention to politics, except all I knew was that I liked Nixon. I was afraid of all the violence and anarchy that was becoming stirred up in the wake of the protests and assassinations. Bill Clinton has revived the credibility gap and given it new stature and meaning, says Naomi Emery, again in the Weekly Standard. Now, you may not like me quoting at such great length from the Weekly Standard because, to your mind at least, it might be the evil New Republic, just as Austin Powers' evil alter ego, Dr. Evil, said, "I didn't spend 6 years in evil medical school to have to listen to this." So, in any event, so let us then quote from The Nation, more to your liking, I trust. For many African Americans, particularly poor ones, the idea that the CIA deliberately introduced crack into America's ghettos in order to fund foreign wars against imaginary threats did not seem much of a threat, according to the editors of The Nation. Many of the things that are new aren't true, and many of the things that are true aren't new, says Doyle McManus. There is a certain irony about a country living in peace. The world tends to lose interest in its fate. Why, look at Cambodia. Nobody gave a hoot about Cambodia until the Pol Pot thing got stirred up again. There's an example of the Pol calling the pot, the Pol Pot calling the kettle black. Never trust a draft dodger. Not a draft resistor, mark you, a draft dodger, says the late Murray Kempton, cited by Alexander Cockburn. One would hear Kempton's voice glaring down an aisle, fashioning the column that daily showed up in his newspaper as the final edition of those monologues, soliloquies, and soliloquies of the previous day. In that, in fact, his technique has very much in common with Mark Twain's. Mark Twain would, in fact, speak at length, then fashion his remarks into a column, and then commit them to the cold prose of a book-length production, or at least so we are given to understand. Now, as long as we're off on this tangent, oh yeah, we got all sorts of data about Mark Twain for you. There is a fascinating site on the web, which unfortunately I can't seem to find the papers that go along with it. So it's of little use to you or me. So let me pause for just a moment. I thought maybe I would try to slow things down a little bit. So I'll show you this grinning man. I'm sorry, I'm sure what he has to say is far more interesting and amusing than what I am saying at this time, but let's see him try to compete with Mark Twain. Yes, Saint Mark. There's a website that you can access via http://marktwain.miningco.com/library/weekly, and it has all sorts of stuff about Mark Twain, pages and pages of the quotable Mark Twain, including things that Mark Twain didn't actually say. There is no character, howsoever good and fine, but it can be destroyed by ridicule, howsoever poor and witless. Observe the ass, for example. His character is about perfect. He is the choicest spirit among all the humbler animals. Yet see what ridicule brought him to. Instead of feeling complimented when we are called an ass, we are left in doubt. So, one of the most striking differences between a cat and a lie is that a cat only has 9 lives. It is easy to find fault if one has that disposition. There was once a man who, not being able to find any other fault with his coal, complained that there were too many prehistoric toads in it. October. This is one of the peculiarly dangerous months to speculate in stocks in. The others are July, January, September, April, November, May, March, June, December, August, and February. Although I might add, not particularly in that order. Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. If you pick up a starving dog and make him prosperous, he will not bite you. This is the principal difference between a dog and a man. Gratitude and treachery are merely two extremities of the same procession. Few things are harder to put up with than the annoyance of a good example. It were not best that we should all think alike. It is difference of opinion that makes horse races. April 1st. This is the day upon which we are reminded what we are on the other 364. It was this wonderful to find America, but it would have been more wonderful to miss it. When in doubt, tell the truth. It is more trouble to make a maxim than it is to do right. Truth is the most valuable thing we have. Let us economize it. It could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctly Native American criminal class except Congress. The timid man yearns for full value and asks a tenth. The bold man strikes for double and compromises on par. There is a moral sense and there is an immoral sense. History shows us that the moral sense enables us to perceive morality and how to avoid it, and the immoral sense enables us to perceive immorality and how to enjoy it. It is easier to stay out than to get out. It is by the goodness of God that in our country we have those three unspeakably precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the prudence never to practice either of them. Man will do many things to get himself loved. He will do all things to get himself envied. There are people who can do all fine and heroic things but one: keep from telling their happinesses to the unhappy. Man is the only animal that blushes, or needs to. The universal brotherhood of man is our most precious possession, what there is of it. When people do not respect us, we are sharply offended, yet deep down in his private heart, no man much respects himself. The man with a new idea is a crank until the idea succeeds. The autocrat of Russia possesses more power than any other man on the earth, but he cannot stop a sneeze. Unlike me, the wrong hero, I, in fact, can stop a sneeze. To succeed in the other trades, capacity must be shown. In the law, concealment of it will do. Prosperity is the best protector of principle. Words to remember when we consider the budget agreement recently struck by Bill Clinton and the Republican Congress. Few of us can stand prosperities, another man's, I mean. And again, this has a great deal of bearing upon the envy that television promotes among people who are among the have-nots. There is an old-time toast which is golden for its beauty. When you ascend the hill of prosperity, may you not meet a friend. That's funny, because when I first read this, I thought it was, when you ascend the hill of prosperity, you may not meet a friend. The old saw says, let a sleeping dog lie. Right. Still, when there is much at stake, it is better to get a newspaper to do it. It takes your enemy and your friend working together to hurt you to the heart, the one to slander you and the other to get the news to you. If the desire to kill and the opportunity to kill came always together, who would escape hanging? Let me make the superstitions of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws, or its songs either. True irreverence is disrespect for another man's God. There are 869 different forms of lying, but only one of them has been squarely forbidden. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Of course, if the guy lives 2 doors down, that's a kind of a moot point. Make it a point to do something every day that you don't want to do. This is the golden rule for acquiring the habit of doing your duty without pain. Do not part with your illusions. When they are gone, you may still exist, but you have ceased to live. Often, the surest way to convey misinformation is to tell the strict truth. In the first place, God made idiots. This was for practice. Then he made school boards. There are no people who are quite so vulgar as the over-refined ones. In statesmanship, get the formalities right. Never mind about the moralities. The very ink with which all history is written is merely fluid prejudice. There isn't a parallel of latitude, but thinks it would have been the equator if it had its rights. And here are some maxims from the British edition of Following the Equator, some of which are not very well known because they were only in the British edition of Following the Equator, also called More Tramps Abroad. History is better than prophecy. In fact, history is prophecy. And history says that whenever a weak and ignorant people possess a thing which a strong and enlightened people want, it must be yielded up peaceably. Honesty is often the best policy, but sometimes the appearance of it is worth 6 of it. Punjabi proverb: the altar cloth of one eon is the doormat of the next. There are many scapegoats for our sins, but the most popular one is providence. Time and tide wait for no man. a pompous and self-satisfied proverb, and was true for 1 billion years. But in our day of electric wires and water ballast, we turn it around. Man waits not for time nor tide. Forget and forgive. This is not difficult when properly understood. It means that you are to forget inconvenient duties and forgive yourself for forgetting. In time, by rigid practice and stern determination, it comes easy. And now, more maxims of Mark Twain, some of which are incredibly obscure. And it's filed under More Maxims of Mark on the Mark Twain website, http://marktwainminingcompany.com. An uneasy conscience is a hair in the mouth. All the talk used to be about doing people good. Now, it is about doing people. Always acknowledge a fault frankly. This will throw those in authority off their guard and give you opportunity to commit more. All schools, all colleges have two great functions: to confer and to conceal valuable knowledge. The theological knowledge which they conceal cannot justly be regarded as less valuable than that which they reveal. That is, when a man is buying a basket of strawberries, it can profit him to know that the bottom half of it is rotten. Better a broken promise than none at all. The burnt child shuns the fire until next day. By and by, when each nation has 20,000 battleships and 5 million soldiers, we shall all be safe, and the wisdom of statesmanship will stand confirmed. Circumstances make man, not man circumstances. Civilization is a limitless multiplication of unnecessary necessaries. Clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no influence in society. Do your duty today and repent tomorrow. Do your duty, do good when you can, and charge when you think they will stand it. Difference between savage and civilized man. One is painted, the other gilded. Do not put off till tomorrow what can be put off till the day after tomorrow just as well. Do not tell fish stories where the people know you, but particularly don't tell them where they know the fish. Etiquette requires us to admire the human race. Everybody's private motto: it's better to be popular than right. Every man is wholly honest to himself and to God, but not to anyone else. God's noblest work? Man. Who found it out? Man. Honesty was the best policy. Honesty. The best of all the lost arts. It is wiser to find out than to suppose. It is hard enough luck being a monarch without being a target also. It is a solemn thought. Dead, the noblest man's meat is inferior to pork. If we had less statesmanship, we could get along with fewer battleships. It is not best to use our morals weekdays. It gets them out of repair for Sunday. It is better to take what does not belong to you than to let it lie around neglected. Is a person's public and private opinion the same? It is thought there have been instances. It is the foreign element that commits our crimes. There is no native criminal class except Congress. It is not likely that any complete life has ever been lived which was not a failure in the secret judgment of the person that lived it. It is sound statesmanship to add 2 battleships every time our neighbor adds 1, and 2 stories to our skyscrapers every time he piles a new one on top of his'n to threaten our light. There is no limit to this soundness but the sky. The lack of money is the root of all evil. The low level which commercial morality has reached in America is deplorable. We have humble, God-fearing Christian men among us who will stoop to do things for $1 million that they ought not to be willing to do for less than 2 millions. Morals consist of political morals, ecclesiastical morals, and morals. No man is straightly honest to any but himself and God. The old political gospel. Public office is a public trust. The new political gospel. Public office is private graft. More maxims of Mark Twain, and then we'll get back to our main event, The Wrong Hero, presenting Pap. Never tell the truth to people who are not worthy of it. Nothing incites to money crimes like great poverty or great wealth. None but an ass pays a compliment and asks a favor at the same time. There are many asses. Admiral Nelson would have been afraid of 10,000 fleas, but a flea wouldn't be afraid of 10,000 Nelsons. An optimist, a person who travels on nothing from nowhere to happiness. Obscurity and a competence. That is the life that is best worth living. Pessimist, the optimist who didn't arrive. Prophecy, 2 bullseyes out of a possible 1,000,000. Public servant, persons chosen by the people to distribute the graft. Patriot, the person who can holler the loudest without knowing what he is hollering about. The real yellow peril, gold. Senator, person who makes laws in Washington when not doing time. Some of us cannot be optimists, but all of us can be bigamists. There is no sadder sight than a young pessimist, except an old optimist. To create man was a quaint and original idea, but to add the sheep was tautology. The trouble ain't that there is too many fools, but that the lightning ain't distributed right. That George could refrain from telling the lie is not the remarkable feature, but that he could do it offhand that way. Vote. The only commodity that is peddleable without a license. We all live in the protection of certain cowardices, which we call our principles. What is human life? The first third a good time, the rest remembering about it. Work and play are words used to describe the same thing under differing conditions. When a man arrives at great prosperity, God did it. When he falls into disaster, he did it himself. What is the difference between a taxidermist and a tax collector? The taxidermist takes only your skin. We are always more anxious to be distinguished for a talent which we do not possess than to be praised for the 15 which we do possess. You can straighten a worm, but the crook is in him and only waiting. Wherefore, being all of one mind, we do highly resolve that government of the grafted by the grafter for the grafter shall not perish from the earth. And that pretty much brings to a close our presentation of the maxims of Mark Twain. By no means was this an exhaustive list, mind you, but simply the cream of the crop, and of course the ones that have at least something to do with our subject at hand, which is politics. Now, getting back to Murray Kempton, who provoked this incredibly lengthy digression, at the level of sentiment he incarnated the old bohemian idea of what a journalist should be, a person of culture yet of street knowledge, on hire to a proprietor, but never a hireling. Murray Kempton wrote long sentences and Herb Caen one-liners, but both learned the same trick, how to get swiftly to the top of your game on a daily basis and give at least the illusion of being at the top of your game on a slow day. Two ways of sizing people up: giving people 100 points on the plus side of the ledger, and then add or subtract as performance warranted. The other way was to allocate a stinted zero balance and take things forward from there. Kempton could never write fortissimo as H.L. Mencken could, an ability that has its pros and cons. H.L. Mencken could be a lout and a bully. Kempton hated to be straightforwardly rude. Critical race theorists say that there are competing racial versions of reality that may never be reconciled, says Patrick J. Williams. Well, that's interesting, too, because I just read something not too long ago, which I might as well share with you, as long as we're jumping around like this. Will E. Nil E. Helter Skelter. It has to do with something that that was said by Frank Kermode. Students need to learn that excellent poetry may, in fact almost always must, express practical, religious, or social convictions they cannot share. First must come the recognition of a certain admirable mastery and the perception of some benefit in recognizing it. The direct experience of poetry is what will enrich them. For pedagogues to argue that the political bearing of a work of literature is the most important thing about it, or that it ought first to be studied as just another document in some historical power negotiation, is, in my view, a subversion of their calling. It is a simple logical error to start from the indisputable fact that everything has a political dimension and arrive at the proposition that politics is always the most important dimension. This erroneous belief has resulted in the reduction of criticism to a single quest for the defining political quest. Political correctness itself would have been impossible except as a product of a historical process that the politically correct despise. True criticism doesn't have a single approach label attached to it. So keep that in mind. This was a quote taken at length from the Atlantic of August 1997. And so let us consider what we've just said and go back to what Patrick J. Williams said, or maybe it was Patricia J. Williams. Critical race theorists say that there are competing racial versions of reality that may never be reconciled. It is a colder and willfully sillier sensibility than Pete Hamill's, forged by split-second attention spans, early credit cards, faith in health clubs, and the flattening effect of 40 years of information. The live to need well overrides most other considerations, says John Lombardi, quoting Eric Alterman, or vice versa. Well, as Pete Hamill put it, news is a verb. Actually, it's not strictly true. News is a noun. It means new things. In part as a reaction to the heavy right-wing slant of the New York Post, Hamill rejected responsibility for editorial and op-ed pages, which remain a neoconservative nest. I told Mort, he explains, you can endorse torture if you want, just don't try to get me to run a 6-part series on how great it is. A newspaper, Hamill muses, can act as a kind of Latin American Zocalo, where different cultures collide on the plaza, rub off on one another, and then go home. To publish a good newspaper today is simply an act of faith. Now, Pete Hamill, at last I heard, was the guy who was in charge of the New York Post, in case you're wondering. An American redneck accent is a universal phonetic code for evil. Interestingly enough. Unfair. Since when has politics been anything else? This is a quote by Bruce Anderson in The Spectator of May 17th. Well, we managed to kill some time and have some laughs along the way. And now, I have to continue. Huh, you thought I was going to end, huh? Fooled ya. And that's the essence of comedy. I fooled you. In fact, we got quite a ways to go yet. More than I am willing to do, in fact. But that's okay. See, I want you to understand why I'm going on at such length. I have 2 hours of this to fill every week. And of course, I do tend to fall behind. I mean, doing 2 hours takes more than 2 hours, of course. It takes endless hours of notation. And sometimes my notations get ahead of me, as is the case here. And they sort of just pile up into an enormous backlog. And then I also find myself in the circumstance where I have got to produce or perish. Now this is going out on September 23rd. I am recording it on August 6th. Now theoretically that puts me a good, I don't know, 9 weeks ahead of schedule. But all next week I won't be able to produce anything. So that'll put me 8 weeks ahead of schedule. And then the week after that, I will have to somehow contrive to come up with another 3 weeks worth of material in order to get to a point where I feel satisfied that if I have to take a lengthy hiatus, I will not, and you will not suffer thereby. Theoretically, I can get to the end of the year by September, and then not have to worry about anything until, of course, the end of the year, at which point I might decide to show reruns. See, I have a 7-year backlog of things that you have only seen once, if at all, which I can show, and no one the wiser. I want to switch governments, says Sammy the Bull Gravano to the FBI, cited by Peter Mass, who in turn is quoted by Donald E. Westlake in the New York Times Book Review of May 18th. Writers of Washington novels have a terrible problem. Just about no one gives them any credit for having any imagination. They can win points for carpentering together clever and ingenious plots, but who believes they actually make up the characters they write about? That's a good point, because, of course, I wrote a novel-length manuscript, which I have been unsuccessfully attempting to peddle as a dramatic work for quite some time. And I know that nobody's going to believe that you invented your character out of whole cloth. People often ask me, what's the difference between writing poetry and writing fiction? And surely it is this. With a lyric poem, you look and meditate and put the rock back. With fiction, you poke things with a stick to see what will happen. But with both, there has to be something under the rock first, and that's the part you can't control or predict. This is where hope and despair and writer's block come into it. As all fiction writers, and especially all poets, know, there's some part of your work that can't be chosen. It chooses you, and you can either follow where it leads or not, says Margaret Atwood. Most talk about the writer's role in society is wrong-headed, not because the writer doesn't have a role in society. We can't help expressing our own age and our own geographical and political and intellectual space, one way or another, but because it is creative death to distort your writing in favor of an external agenda. Well, in other words, I guess what she's saying is write from the heart. And if you have nothing to say, at least figure out a way of saying it which will cause the least amount of harm. The Christian right still beats its jungle drums in the Chigger Belt, calling for war with China. Yes, those statesmen. The Clintons have been the Fort Knox of the right. In other words, the right wing has been mining political gold out of the Clinton scandals. It is not unusual to see the dirt dug up in human events recycled in Regnery books and marketed through the Conservative Book Club, creating an anti-Clinton echo chamber. Where it's at now is no longer conservative versus liberal, Goldberg said. It's clean versus unclean. People want the scandal, the dish, and no one dishes quite like Regnery publications. The United States is becoming known throughout the world as the timid colossus. Feral tabloid newspapers, lousy food, losers at sport, whinging palms were among the most enduring Australian impressions of Britain. Well, let's talk a little bit about taxes. I found an interesting article It's actually an excerpt from a book, and it's titled "The First Case of Tax Reduction. It was a failure." Turns out that the Sumerian city-state of Lagash in the 24th century BC consisted of a small group of prosperous towns, each clustering around a temple. By and large, the inhabitants were farmers and cattle breeders, boatmen and fishermen, merchants and craftsmen. Its economy was mixed, partly state-controlled, partly capitalistic. In theory, the soil belonged to the city god and therefore, presumably, to his temple, which held it in trust for all the citizens. In actual practice, while the temple corporation owned a good deal of land, which it rented out to some of the people as sharecroppers, much of the soil was the private property of the individual citizen. During cruel wars and their tragic aftermath, the citizens of Lagash find themselves deprived of their political and economic freedom. In order to raise armies and supply them with arms and equipment, the rulers find it necessary to infringe on the personal rights of the individual citizen, to tax his wealth and property to the limit, and to appropriate property belonging to the temple. Under the impact of war, these rulers met with little opposition. Once domestic controls were in the hands of the palace coterie, its members were most unwilling to relinquish them, even in peacetime, for the controls proved highly profitable. Indeed, our ancient bureaucrats devised a variety of sources of revenue and income, taxes and imposts, that might well be the envy of their modern counterparts. Even death brought no relief from levies and taxes. At this low point in the political and social affairs of Lagash, a new and God-fearing ruler came to the fore. Urukagina by name, who restored justice and freedom to the long-suffering citizens. He removed the inspector of boatmen from the boats. He removed the cattle inspector from the cattle. He removed the fishery inspector from the fisheries. Temple property was now highly respected. From one end of the land to the other, there was no tax collector. He, Urukagina, established the freedoms of the citizens of Lagash. He also put a stop to the injustice and exploitation suffered by the poor at the hands of the rich. Urukagina also cleared the city of usurers, thieves, and murderers. How helpful and effective were these reforms in the struggle for power between Lagash and Umma? Unfortunately, they failed to bring about the expected strength and victory. Urukagina and his reforms were soon gone with the wind. Like many another reformer, he seemed to have come too late with too little. His reign lasted less than 10 years, and he and his city were soon overthrown by Lugal-Zaggisi, the ambitious ruler of nearby Umma, who succeeded in making himself the king of Sumer and the surrounding lands. The Urukagina reforms and their social implications made a profound impression on our ancient historians. Freedom under the law, it should now be evident, was a way of life not unknown to the Sumerians of 3000 BC. We see reflections of ourselves in the peoples of the ancient lands of Sumer and Egypt. History, it is said, repeats itself. The fact is a testimony to human stupidity, said Edith Hamilton, the eminent classical scholar. And yet, she said, history is really a chart to guide us. This is from the book History Begins at Sumer by Samuel Noah Kramer, published by Doubleday Anchor, 1959, pages 45 through 50. In case you wish to read more about the first case of tax reform. Well, some more bad things about Al Gore. The Weekly Standard, particularly the issue of June 2nd, just can't seem to get enough of bashing Al Gore. Even measured against other American politicians, Al Gore is a consummate phony and chameleon. Zealous pseudo-environmentalism, anti-science and anti-technology views, and the damage they have wrought in public policy. Gore seems sorry the Dark Ages ever ended. Armand Hammer bankrolled the senior Senator Gore to gain Washington access. He also directly or indirectly financed young Al's expensive education. Well, let's jump directly to another topic. Surveillance of employees at the workplace by employers. 38% of employers keep records of employees' phone calls. 16% videotape their employees. 15% store and review employees' email. 14% store and review employees' computer files. Now, here is something that I should let you know right now. If you are going to spend work time fiddling around on the internet looking for interesting sites, it's better to download these onto paper and take them away and then close up your internet site and not bookmark it, because of course your employer can easily go into your internet site file and see what you've bookmarked and be able to figure out from that just how much time you've been wasting on non-productive things. So keep that in mind. Download everything you want to keep immediately. Don't bookmark anything unless it's work-related. 10% of employers tape telephone conversations, and 5% of employers tape and review voicemail. More would do that, but they haven't figured out the technology yet. Lucky for you. Now Joe Kennedy is faced with a situation which, even if English were his first language, he couldn't explain, says the ever-amusing Howie Carr. Howie, I hope you're out there and listening to this. And I hope you don't mind me quoting you at such great length. Until recently, news was stories of other people, of the world beyond the self. Well, that's an unattributed quote. William Powers cites it from the Washington, D.C. Newseum. There's a museum of newspapers called the Newseum in Washington, D.C. USA Today and the larger Gannett Empire are the ultimate exemplars of a new ego-warming journalism in which the news is not hard-edged and discordant like the World, but smooth and soothing, even tending toward a marketably bright consensus. Every word seems to have gone through a homogenizing happy filter, and rare is the story that feels as raw and eccentric as real life. Hope is a good thing if it's authentic and fed by truth, but when it's a simplifying sop, a tool for tricking people into liking you, it can be dangerous. Well, some more eulogies about Murray Kempton, Mike Royko, and Herb Cain, all cited from the New Republic of June 2nd, 1997. Murray Kempton, of the elliptical phrase and sardonic sensibility, was the Anglican priest of New York City, periodically rising to awe-inspiring levels of moral indignation over the transgressions of the mighty and the sufferings of the powerless. There's no excuse for kicking someone unless he's up, he once said, quoted by Ronald Steele. Murray Kempton, with his finely honed intelligence and his exquisite sensibility, he gave elitism, that is, the responsibility of the educated and privileged to provide moral example, a good name. Mike Royko was cut of rougher stuff. He did not lecture the fortunate on their duties, but the working class on their rights, and he savored taking on the powerful. He was Chicago's bartender, the kind of guy you'd meet on a bar stool on the city's west side. Imagine Nelson Algren working the beat and writing for, not just about, the housewife, the cop, and the factory worker. Herb Cain could have become an institution only in San Francisco. He was at once the city's Boswell and its concierge. No event was too trivial to capture his attention, for it was all part of the glorious, messy mosaic of a city that has elevated nasal gazing into a high art. He was every man's Armistead Maupin, relating his tales of the city bound together by iron cords of gossip. These three journalists, Ronald Steele goes on to say, were all chroniclers of the city, disparate individuals yearning to be connected to the greater mass of which they were a part. And that is what these three men did for their readers. Well, of course, Howie Carr and Mike Barnacle are all wannabe Mike Roykos, I suppose. Neither of them aspire to the heights of a Murray Kempton or a Herb Cain. For that matter, I don't think I could aspire to the heights of a Murray Kempton or a Herb Cain. And I'm not sure I'd like to be a Mike Royko either. So I'm going to find one to talk. Shoram Bagora. Dick Gephardt is standing on principle again. You can tell he is because he said so himself, says the New Republic of June 9th. There is no doubting the sincerity of the man, or of his emotions, at least when he is speaking. New Jersey Representative Mike Pappas urged his fellow Republicans to vote against Congressman Kennedy's amendment. By delivering the tabloid-reported scandal as a media ethics story, Howard Kurtz launders the news itself for mainstream resale in the frame of a chin-scratcher about media ethics. Kurtz keeps the media gentry for whom he speaks at a comfortable distance from their gutter-snipe cousins, accuses William Powers. In other words, the Inquirer leads with some O.J. scandal or some tragic little beauty queen found strangled type scandal. And Howard Kurtz decides that it's an example of what's wrong with the media and reports on it, thereby making it acceptable for mainstream consumption. So he has the best of both worlds, while pretending to deplore what he is actually profiting from. He can thereby give the impression of a high scholar of mediaship while also giving us the entertainment value we crave. The supermarket weeklies are the unlikely tribunes of an exacting moral code, a set of rules that reflects how most Americans think much more faithfully than does the minimalist moral system that informs the coverage of the big media outlets. See, now there's the big difference between Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon. People got the impression that Nixon was kind of sneaky. See, there was this public outcry against Nixon that was sort of fanned by the media, whereas the media of today recognize that Bill Clinton is by no means perfect. He is no saint. rather a sinner, but a jovial one at that. And because of that, and because Clinton himself appears to recognize this fact and not attempt to skulk around, like his brilliant comment that he had smoked pot but he didn't inhale. On the one hand, he acknowledges having done it. On the other hand, he makes it into a type of joke which makes it easy to forgive him. He admits his flaws, but with a little wink at his own peccadillos, which makes us feel sympathetic towards him. In the pages of the National Enquirer, drug abuse, infidelity, and myriad other wrongs are often forgiven. But if you're caught pretending to be something you're not, caught being too big for your britches, they'll flay you. Violators are swiftly, gleefully cut down. For example, the Frank Gifford and Kathy Lee scandal. The tone here is the one we reserve for misfortunes that befall evil neighbors. The unmistakable sound of back fence schadenfreude. Schadenfreude being, of course, joy at another's sadness. The elite media are pickpocketing the tabloids' expensive stories with one hand and tisk-tisking them with another. Well, getting off that tack for a moment, after 2 decades of watching from the sidelines as Democrats worked the system for personal advantage, the outsider figured it was his turn, says the exquisitely named Grover Norquist, cited by Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, what's he doing in the New Republic? I thought he wrote for the Weekly Standard. Maybe I'm wrong. Now, this is time to digress. I actually knew Grover Norquist in college. He was the business manager of the Harvard Advocate. And as you can see from this time lapse, we're looking at some pretty sophisticated stuff, boy. A time lapse is a wonderful thing. Of course, if there are actually living objects in it, then it's even more wonderful. But, well, I guess trees qualify. But, you see, trees don't do an awful lot. You have to have a time lapse set in terms of 1 year. 1 photograph per year. Now, my time lapse is interesting. There's a manual time lapse, there's a 30-second, 1 minute, 2 minute, and 5 minute time lapse, which I have used to telling effect. Well, remember when George Bush jumped out of that plane? Why do you suppose he did it? Well, it was a slow news cycle. When did he do that? I think that was sometime in late May. According to Stephen Glass, Bush's leap was covered in that very special tone of sanctimoniousness and patronizing goodwill that reporters reserve for those who have surpassed society's low expectations for them by accomplishing what would, for most people, be regarded as modest achievements. Bush always had the unfortunate habit of telling the press the manipulative reasons behind his staged appearances. For example, when he gave that speech in New Hampshire in 1992 and said, "Message, I care." Stephen Glass goes on to say, "The First Church of George Herbert Walker Christ, run by a handful of evangelicals who hold that Bush is the reincarnation of Christ, came into being during the Gulf War, when its founders began preaching that the conflict was Armageddon. Members adhere to strict dietary laws similar to Jewish kosher, prohibitions against broccoli, and in spite of anything George Bush might have to say, also prohibitions against pork rinds." As he steps through the revolving door and into the lobby, John Sununu gives a triumphant thumbs up like presidents sometimes do when they deplane from Air Force One. The lobby is nearly empty, apart from a very old man sitting on a couch holding a tattered copy of Architectural Digest. The man is falling asleep and is snoring loudly. Sununu swivels clockwise on his right foot toward the front desk. "Good work, men," he tells the lone bellboy as he walks past him. A few steps later he gives a swift nod to the concierge and walks on. As he walks, he beams. He says to himself out loud, "They love me." He passes another hotel guest and gives him the thumbs up too. That, I say, was none other than John Sununu. The bellboy finally asks, "Who's Sumumu?" Well, Charlie Chaplin had formidable inward demons to contend with, like other creative souls who arrange their public behavior as a continuous performance. The wrong hero has formidable outward demons, like other people who fail to get any sort of political capital out of their performances. People who are not being scrutinized, like the wrong hero, can get away with everything. James McGregor Burns, the god of no foreign war. Well, as Daniel Shore says, you know that Bill Clinton is serious about an issue when he brings to it some of the intensity of an election campaign. Daniel Shore writes for the New Leader, and that quote came from the April 21st edition of that fine publication. Another fine publication, one which I do not always, or in fact seldom even, agree with, is Reason. Phil Graham, cited by the Associated Press as quoted in Reason magazine. Since I started studying the fire ants issue, I see them everywhere. I had a dream the other night they were conspiring to kill me. Fire ants have reached a point of disruption in everything, from agriculture to playgrounds, that we need to do something about it. Yes, indeed, that's a good presidential platform. We need to do something about them there fire ants. Don't give a hoot and hell about anything else. It's them fire ants we got to be looking out for. Not the deficit, not foreign affairs, but domestic affairs, as exemplified by them there fire ants. Well, of course, we got this really, really great campaigns and elections of May 1997. You might want to look it up for yourself, actually. It's got this incredibly wonderful list of all the nicknames of all the major political figures of the past 3 or 4 centuries. Well, maybe not all of them, quite a few. William Howard Taft was known as his acreage. Governor Samuel Tilden, the loser, of course, in the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, which some have said was the most corrupt election ever held in America for president. Governor Samuel Tilden was known as Old Usufruct and Slippery Sam. John Tyler was known as His Accidency, since he took office in the wake of the death of General Taylor. The populist Congressman Jeremiah Simpson of Kansas was known as Sockless Jerry. Governor William L. O'Daniel was popularly known as Pass the Biscuits Pappy because he became governor on the strength of a radio show that he did with the Light Crust Doughboys, a popular Western swing group of the day. Senator Carl Munt, Republican of South Dakota, was known as the Leaning Tower of Putty. President James Monroe was called the Last Cocked Hat. Margaret Thatcher, of course, was known as the Iron Lady. General George McClellan as Little Mac and Mac the Unready. Marie Antoinette was known as Madame Deficit. Governor William Murray of Oklahoma was known as Alfalfa Bill. Vice President James Sherman was called Short-Weight Jim. Huey Long was the Kingfish. Martin Van Buren was the Little Magician, Old Kinderhook, Martin Van Ruin, and Whiskey Van. Thurlow Weed was known as the Lucifer of the Lobby. Fiorello LaGuardia was known as the Little Flower. Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald was known as the Boneless Wonder. That was a name that was given to him, I believe, by the waspish Winston Churchill, unless it was Randolph Churchill who gave him that name. Mayor Jimmy Walker of New York City was known as Bo James, and in fact, Bo James is the title of the biography of him. Jerry Brown was called Governor Moonbeam. William Henry Harrison is known as Old Tippecanoe, Hard Cider Harrison, and General Mum. And of course, he was the one who died, and Vice President Tyler became president in his wake. Rutherford Hayes, the winner of the disputed Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, was known as his fraudulency and Old 8-7, because a special election panel was convened as a result of the 1876 election with 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 bipartisan member. And Rutherford Hayes basically won the presidency on the strength of 8 votes to 7 after this panel had voted. There's a story that the independent swing voter was going to vote for Tilden, but some men came to him late at night, and the following morning he had completely reversed his decision. Talk about your conspiracy theories. How would American history be different if Samuel Tilden had become president? Well, that is something we'll never know. Senator Everett Dirksen was known as the Wizard of Ooze. John Adams was called Old Sink or Swim, and his rotundity. Louisiana Governor Edwin Edwards was known as the Silver Zipper. Senator Dianne Feinstein was called Di-Fi. Arizona Governor Evan Meacham, the fellow who didn't want Martin Luther King Day to be an official holiday in Arizona, was called Evan the Terrible. Prime Minister William Pitt was known as Bottomless Pitt. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana was known as Bolshevik Bert. Louisiana Senator Joseph Ransdell was called the Feather Duster. Congressman Bill Lemke of North Dakota was called Liberty Bell, I think because he ran under the Liberty Party, a splinter group, in the 1936 elections. Senator James Vardaman of Mississippi was known as the Grand White Chief. Populist Governor Ben Tillman of South Dakota was called Pitchfork Ben. Governor Ben Butler of Massachusetts was called Spoons. Governor W.R. Waite of Colorado was called Bloody Bridles. Governor Albert Chandler of Kentucky was known as Happy Chandler. Tommy Corcoran was Tommy the Cork, one of FDR's advisors. Progressive Senator William Borah of Idaho was called the Great Opposer. Senator Claude Pepper of Florida was known as Old Salt and Pepper and Red Pepper. Speaker Thomas Reed was known as Czar Reed. California Assembly Speaker Jesse Unruh was known as Big Daddy. James Buchanan was called the Bachelor President. Lloyd Benson is known as Loophole Lloyd. Chicago Mayor Anton Chermak, who was killed in an assassination attempt upon Franklin Delano Roosevelt shortly after his inauguration in 1933, was called 10% Tony. The current mayor of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry is called Mayor Barely, and our current Vice President Al Gore is known as Prince Albert. There's also an interesting chart which states that the best president for leadership was FDR and the worst was Harding. The best presidents for accomplishments in crisis management was Lincoln, and the worst was his predecessor, Buchanan. The best president for character and integrity was again Lincoln, and the worst, guess who? Nixon. The best for political skill, FDR. The worst, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor. The best president for appointments was Washington. Of course, he had a great crowd to choose from. And the worst was Harding. Top 10 presidents were Lincoln, FDR, Washington, Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Truman, Jackson, Eisenhower, and Madison. The bottom 4, Harding, Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, and finally, Grant. This is from the book Rating the Presidents by Ridings and McIver, which I'm going to have to actually read at some point. I've snatched it up from the new book cart, but I have yet to actually make my way through it. Well, I guess we're slowly but surely diminishing the amount of time that we have left. The base model of political speechifying, according to Campbell Bell. Tell the voters something they already believe about the party. Bridge to the swing voters by telling them exactly what you did with the money you saved. And the final step is to close with a fact that solidifies the base, but also a fact swing voters are willing to believe of your party. The party in question being, of course, the Republican Party. Stories of irregularities in the sheriff's race between Florida Sheriff Vogel and the challenger Beckstrom began sweeping through the county in a hurricane of indignation. Unsolicited absentee ballots had supposedly arrived at numerous households, some addressed to dead people, others to Republicans but not their Democratic spouses. People arrived at the polls only to be told they had already voted or had requested an absentee ballot and would not be admitted to the booth. At the close, Beckstrom was 4,000 ahead. An unexpected avalanche of more than 27,000 absentee votes, 18% of total ballots cast, put Vogel ahead with a slim 798 vote margin. Final results, Vogel 50.3%, Beckstrom 49.7%. Well, Jay Leno had this to say about Heaven's Gate. They lived in a commune and they shared everything, so they could have been Democrats. Yet they owned a mansion and had no interest in sex, so they could have been Republicans. A series of scattered random quotes. I never thought my speeches were too long. I enjoyed them, said Hubert Humphrey. You do not want to elect politicians who say trust me, because you can't trust anybody, said Newt Gingrich in 1978. In politics, guts is all, says Barbara Castle. In politics, what begins in fear usually ends in folly, says Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Politics is a blood sport, says Aneurin Bevan. I do not mind lying, but I hate inaccuracy, says Samuel Butler. I'm not smart enough to lie, said Ronald Reagan. Idealists may have their faults, but they rarely steal, said Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Any statistic that appears interesting is almost certainly a mistake, says A.S.C. Ehrenberg. Statistics are like alienists, that is, psychiatrists. They will testify for either side, said Fiorella LaGuardia. Statistics are for losers, says Scotty Bowman. If Lincoln were alive today, he'd roll over in his grave, according to Gerald Ford. Norman Mailer, when he ran for when he ran for the mayor of New York in 1969, had as his slogan, "Throw the rascals in." And finally, Aristotle has said, "Good laws, if they are not obeyed, do not constitute good government." Well, I put some bird seed out for the birds, and of course now they're having a riotous old time, getting fat, mooching at my expense. Well, Kim Il-sung was known as the eternal son of the nation and the greatest genius of mankind. However, his son doesn't quite live up to that reputation and is only known as the savior of present-day human music. And of course, the fact that people are starving in North Korea is euphemistically referred to as the people's food problem. The Roman Catholic Church, according to Catholic radio host Michael Enright, is the greatest criminal organization outside of the mafia. He then later said he was joking. Of course, only in Canada could something like this happen. And in fact, the citation is from Maclean's of May 26th, which always comes a week late. You'll be happy to know. So the news in it is always 2 weeks old. Well, according to the New Democrat of May-June 1997, like John Quincy Adams and Herbert Hoover before him, Jimmy Carter has defied Alexander Hamilton's fear that former presidents would affront the country's sensibilities by wandering among the people like discontented ghosts and sighing for a place which they were destined never more to possess. Nevermore. Of course, then there was that president who managed to win 2 non-consecutive terms, whose name I can never remember. Viewers, please call and enlighten me. Well, as Bessie Smith said, 1 ain't for always, and 2 ain't but twice. Something our political campaigners might do well to remember. Counterculture, according to Louis Menand, counterculture only ends up producing another regime of coercion and control, just as people struggling against dictatorships sometimes become terrorists. Paranoia about fanatics is a kind of fanaticism. He is, of course, saying this in the context of the new Thomas Pynchon book in the New York Review of Books of June 12th. There's a lot of quoting going on, but not an awful lot of side commentary, something which I will be sure to remedy, although perhaps not this week. Now here are some lessons that Tony Blair, the current Prime Minister of Great Britain, has learned from Bill Clinton. Tony Blair, like Bill Clinton, enjoys contradictions. Both prefer not so much to resolve them as to, quote, transcend them, get around them, ignore them, or run right through them. Maxim number 1, don't think too big or too small. Maxim number 2, don't forget your political base or your new supporters. Maxim number 3, don't forget your campaign slogans. And don't forget those slogans are effective just because you won. Maxim number 4. Don't break your promises and don't pretend you made the right promises. Maxim number 5. Keep your advantage on the opposition's issues and don't pretend to hold the same positions as they do. Yeah, so far so good, I would say. Now we're getting into a long, dry patch. The source of our human habit of socializing violence, in the terror inspired by the devouring beast, and in the powerful emotions associated with courage and altruism that were required for group defense, says the learned Barbara Ehrenreich in her book recently published, Blood Rights. Fear of patriotism shaped the passions early humans brought to war. Fear of predation, says Barbara Ehrenreich, fear of predation shaped the passions early humans brought to war, and it still does so today. Nationalism is a religion, complete with its own deities, mythology, and rites. In American propaganda during World War I, Jesus was portrayed in uniform, aiming a rifle. Humanity trembled at war as the essence of modernity. Tribal bloodletting has stripped away war's technological veneer and displayed anew its primitive foundations of passion, irrationality, and hatred. Blood rights from the dawn of human experience. Well, according to Jesse Jackson, a failure to act speaks louder than words. According to German Marxist August Bebel, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, the mobilization of envious populism by, rather than against, the ruling order. Amnesty International charges that many cases of police violence in New York violate basic international human rights standards. This, of course, is in The Nation of June 9th. Ronald Reagan learned from John Wayne's later films how to combine amiability with an air of pig-headed menace. Well, once again, I've just come up with a really great title for a future presentation. Pig-headed menace. Indeed. Please make a note of it. I think I will. Steve Erickson notices the cheap redemption white America sought in Colin Powell. And of course there was in the New York Times book review of June 8th. Creepy little details like Steve Forbes' habit of making slashing gestures behind the lectern where nobody can see them, as though the force of his conviction were something to be obscured and hidden, a secret passion like renting pornographic videos. Anyone boring enough that he had to wear a flannel shirt and slap an exclamation point after his name to make himself interesting was either sane to the point of inertia or so metaphysically bone-chillingly demented as to evoke the void. This, of course, is Steve Erickson on Lamar Alexander. The American Empire's two most important contributions to the human race were annihilation and fun, says Steve Erickson on Las Vegas and Alamogordo, New Mexico. Maybe the deficit is what's sapping the polity, But if it's really just another boogeyman invented by the national superego, as some perfectly respectable economists argue, then the political process has become surreal. What could be goofier than a campaign that was ultimately not about anything at all, except perhaps the potlatch-style competitive raising and spending of huge sums of money? Rented strangers, in the political lexicon, cited in Michael Lewis's book Spin, rented strangers are aides, consultants, and spin doctors who write the campaign script. The political system's most debilitating problem, the terror of honest political speech. It takes a lot of money to fake it, to buy ads to distort what you and your opponents really think. People will hate you for being successful. If you want to be perceived as a king, you have to act like one, said Michael Ovitz's father to Michael Ovitz. According to one J. Martin, Claire Booth Luce was the most selfish schemer who ever lived. We're getting down to brass tacks here, as you can no doubt tell. Well, here's what Bob Dole had to say about Bill Clinton. Not very much different from what I had to say about Bill Clinton, strangely enough. He's sort of a likable rogue. This is a guy who's always on the edge. He's always pushing the envelope. Nobody's going to catch me. I didn't do anything wrong. And it doesn't look like that's what happened. Somebody did something wrong. Cited in Woodward's The Choice. Well, we're finally getting down to the wire. By the way, the Louisiana election campaign investigation, which I think was finally quashed by the Democrats, was the first of its kind in 44 years. 44 years. Avoid trivia, says George C. Marshall, founder of the Marshall Plan, to his investigators. Sometimes it is necessary to make things clearer than the truth, says Dean Acheson. Strangely enough, that was also the advice given by the lawyers to Clyde Griffiths in Theodore Dreiser's novel An American Tragedy. Sometimes it is necessary to make things clearer than the truth. In the beginning, we all wanted the police to bomb the crack houses, but now it's backfiring at the cost of the community. I think the cops have been given free rein to intimidate people at large, says Diane Sareen on the New York Police Department, cited by Larry Reepstein. And this was from Newsweek of June 2nd. Pittsburgh residents vote to establish a civil review board to monitor police behavior. Washington, D.C. residents complain of the new police crackdown. This is the only police state that isn't really a police state, but kind of wishes it were. Don't you think? That's something worth writing down. How else do you think I can possibly generate new material? Except by talking. But, you know, there is such a thing as talking too much. And before too long, I will be finished talking for quite some time. What I find is once people get the power, they're so concerned with protecting that power that they're actually more limited than they were in the first place, says Jason Patrick, again cited in, I believe it was, Newsweek, of course. Where else? Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." My revision is, "But the examined life makes you wish you were dead," says Saul Bellow, who, incidentally, is still alive, in case you're interested. It's not the adultery, it's the lying. So goes the argument of various keepers of the public morality, as another person is ruined because of sexual conduct. Well, that's a lie. It is sex. The lying is a collateral offense. Yet another great title, incidentally. Collateral offense. Not the main event, mind you, just a collateral offense. Well, gee, I hate to sound so blasé, or, as Cecil, who used to run the blues jam and the reggae jam, put it, so blasé blah. But I guess we're just about winding down. There are a few hard and fast rules in American politics, but one precept remains ironclad. Never be on the same side of anything as Joe Klein, says Alexander Cockburn. Hey there. Has there ever been a country that had the word democratic in its name that was? Something to keep in mind. Anybody who would ask for your vote doesn't deserve it. I said that. It's fair to say that in France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, voters are chafing at conservative attempts to reduce the role of government, says David Frum in the Weekly Standard of June 9th. Overconfident conservative parties have been playing their bench warmers since 1988. Again, David Frum. He said it. He's a conservative, and he said it. I didn't. There is no doctrine, there are no principles, there is nothing so sacred to New Democrats and New Labor that it won't be traded away if circumstances demand it. Unless politicians of the right come to grips with the new unpredictability, opportunism, fuzziness, and self-contradictions of the new left, they may well never prevail over it. Again, quoting at length from David Frum. President Clinton has a trademark trick of professing to support something while covertly opposing it, like welfare reform, and professing to oppose something while covertly supporting it, like racial quotas. It's a technique that has outwitted politicians of the right again and again and again. The Democrats understand that their leaders' methods are indispensable to their cause. Politicians of the left face an unsolvable set of problems. Every act of redistribution creates at least as many losers as winners. Those inequalities that remain are almost always the product of differences in individual achievement. The failure of pension schemes is increasingly visible to all. Fairness quotas and special preferences strike most people as manifestly unfair. Bill Clinton and Tony Blair are fighting one of the great defensive battles of modern politics. They are trying to preserve antique political institutions in a world that has lost faith in them. The other side has all the ideas. On their side, they have only the weight of inertia, the sentimental appeal of old slogans. the lure of the pork barrel, and their own political skill. Their strategy must be defensive. It calls for waiting for the bigger and more confident side to offer its plans and then sniping at them. Whenever you catch Clinton straddling an issue, you can be pretty sure his own inclinations are at their farthest remove from public opinion. After all, where public opinion is on his side, as is with Medicare, he doesn't need to straddle. The political left has adopted as its most fundamental premise the hope that reality can be denied by a steady stream of vague political rhetoric. But mushy words cannot blind people to craggy facts indefinitely. Truth has a way of asserting itself, no matter how charmingly it's denied. Well, speaking of pap, let's talk a little bit about Rosie O'Donnell, shall we? The culture of Rosie O'Donnell is fast becoming America's culture. The Rosie show is the most nauseating spectacle ever inflicted on the American public. She sets the bar low, aspiring to pattern her show after those of Merv Griffin and Mike Douglas, two witless log rollers most of us were glad to be rid of by the 1980s, says the waspish Matt Labash in the Weekly Standard of June 9th. She was an average stand-up, but she got compensated with her gum-cracking Long Island drive-through attendant spunkiness and clockwork delivery. I can take mediocre material and sell the shit out of it, she said in her early days. She was not always this nice. When I went to hear from an asshole, I'll fart is how she used to dispatch hecklers. Her act was extremely derivative. Jerry Seinfeld, verbatim. If she finds an ounce of weakness in you, she attacks, like a piranha with blood, says a former Rosie O'Donnell staffer. She is a savant, our Rosie, a pop culture repository. As a child, she took notes during the Mary Tyler Moore Show. She is not only an unvarnished fan, but a borderline personality, a stalker even. Billy Joel, Bette Midler, Lucy Arnaz, Cher, Lauren Bacall, and now many of the stalkees come to her. She has broadcast entire suck-up shows, her designation, lobbying the likes of Elton John and Barbra Streisand to appear on the air. Her obsequiousness is unmatched. There are none she does not enthuse over. She has more idols than the ancient Babylonians, so many she can't keep them straight. Her fetishes and obsessions serve as comic grist, which is why she has persisted in her grating Tom Cruise charade, in which she feigns a crush on him. She has mentioned his name on the show over 2,017 times. As the culture has fragmented and cannibalized itself, the only fresh possibility is to revert to the primordial ooze, or, more properly, to pap, which, of course, as you probably know by now, is the title of this presentation. Well, once again quoting from the inestimable journal The New Leader of May 5th, 1997, although 80% of Americans live in metropolitan areas, only 3% live under single metropolitan governments. Now there's a real bone-cracking, yawn-inducing statistic for you. Privately operated, for-profit prisons are multiplying like mushrooms all across the United States. The companies that run them have become Wall Street darlings, and for good reason, says Vince Beiser. Privatization of prisons creates a whole power base to push for continuing to expand the prison population as a source of economic profit, regardless of whether that's a good thing for society. In other words, more prisons means more jobs for prison guards. Well, according to the American Journalism Review of June 1997, cited by Kathy Keeley, everyone knows Washington is a cesspool of cynicism, inhabited by a vicious breed of journalistic sharks. Politicians can't even sit down to lunch in the nation's capital without their motives being questioned. I can't tell you here, but I can leak it to you later, as White House Press Secretary Mike Civ McCurry is fond of saying. Well, I guess we're winding down. One of my favorite phrases. Of course, we've sort of been winding down for the last 2 hours. But this time, we are finally, truly winding down. Let me say this about that. According to according to Joseph Turo, we no longer fear a single enemy bent on our psycho-political subjugation. We dread nothing more than the disuniting of America. By accelerating information transfer from the gait of a horse to the speed of light, the telegraph popularized a lean, telegraphic prose style that eventually drove from the journalistic and literary marketplace the florid writing common through the mid-19th century. The development of brand advertising, coincident with telegraph, department store, and urbanization, hastened the nationalization of the United States. By helping create aggregate demand, advertising quickened the shift to mass production, usurped the primacy of local markets, and ads impelled the nation to coalesce around shared customs. Stuart Ewan, in Captains of Consciousness, complained that the quest to create a national homogeneity focused people's dissatisfactions inward and made the mass production system the solution to them, contributing to a stifling uniformity as this century evolved. But it did sustain the capitalist economic structure and was consistent with the root desires of a population eager for a life of middle-class leisure unthinkable on the farm. Time and time again, advertising has proven powerless to instigate, to sustain, or to reverse trends in public opinion or fashions of consumption. According to Michael Shudson, advertising is capitalist, realist art. Well, you call it what you like, but I call it PAP. Yes, PAP. And this is, of course, the title of our presentation, which we are now beginning to draw to its inevitable, none too soon, close. Advertising celebrates and promotes life and lives worth simulating, according to the definitions laid out by the culture itself. Advertising celebrates and promotes life and lives worth emulating, according to the definitions laid out by the culture itself. But I like my version better, so I'll write it down, thus taking up a precious 15 seconds. Its effect is cumulative, and it works by spurring and meshing with conversations that identify for all participants a communal understanding of the good life. After all, as Hannah Arendt put it, speech is what makes man a political being. Anyhow, the segmentation-induced spiral of commodification, it's currently embroiling the cereal industry, still erodes marketers' margins. Virtually all sitcoms hew to a standard set of moral and comic conventions, and their fans consume them to fill equivalent needs for mindless entertainment. And I guess that will be my last great gasp. Mindless entertainment. Indeed. In fact, you could almost call it PAP, as I have chosen to call this presentation. Success in the marketplace derives not from being different from your competitors, but from being the same. says Andrew Ehrenberg. From 1946 to 1973, advertising came to represent a nation's ambiguous relationship to plenitude. Advertising is a screwball comedy of the kind that Preston Sturges used to make. It's by turns optimistic and cynical, guileless and greedy. It thrives on talk, and it blithely waltzes through contradictions. We have, in the West in particular, a culture of monotheism that goes back to Abraham, which assumes that the world is shaped by imposed control. With the internet, we may see a general deinstitutionalization, humans creating institutions of the moment for the purpose to be served. We're moving to a condition where well-applied citizen action becomes government itself. Well, I'm not quite so sure I would be so optimistic as that, but this is all cited from the Atlantic of June 1997. Time was when the left, spurred only by the Frankfurt School, accused mass cult and the technologies that created it of destroying man's ability to reason, preparing the way for fascism. Now, mass cult nostalgia still seems to represent a dark view of human nature that is actually quite aristocratic and conservative. Well, this concludes our presentation of PAP, and we hope you've enjoyed it. And please tune in next week when we will bring you what I believe to be part 19 of our massive ongoing project. At least I think it's part 19. Let's see. Yeah, it's part 19. This was part 18 entitled PAP. Please tune in next week for part 19, Opinion Only. Remember, the opinions expressed by the wrong hero are those of the wrong hero alone, although in some cases they're not even his opinions. You have been tuned to Cafe Cabaret. Cafe Cabaret is broadcast every Tuesday night on Channel 55, Cambridge Community Television in Cambridge. Also, tune into our companion show, Noise Party, on Channel 55.